It is a sad fact that in every school, in every town, in every country in the world, there are some kids who spend their days terrifying others. I have always hated bullies, and to be honest, in some ways I'm not sure that the word bully quite covers it. That word sounds almost playful nowadays, like something you find in a comic book or a cartoon show where the good guy nerdy kid will eventually use his smarts to get the upper hand. The character of the bully himself is softened, rounded, and made to seem more pleasant and acceptable, as if bullying is all good fun that kids grow out of. Like some kind of Dennis the Menace character. In reality, it's not like that. A real bully is a very dangerous thing. As the head of the constabulary in Moreton, I have encountered my fair share of bullies over the years. People who, for whatever reason, want to make other people's lives a misery. The sad thing is that in most cases, it's for no real reason. Sure, sometimes a bully will also be a thief or a mugger who will either rob his victims or extort money from them, but in many cases, the motive isn't financial or material. The bullies do what they do because they like doing it. They enjoy making others feel small, terrified, or inferior. There is, I have often thought, in the very worst of bullies, the faintest trace of something that can only really be described as evil. That is a special kind of bully, and the kind to which Nathan Fletcher belonged. Nathan Fletcher was, to put it quite bluntly, rotten. Whilst that might be an awful thing to say about a kid of 19, anyone who ever dealt with him would have a hard time disagreeing. For every kid who attended Moreton High School during his 18-month reign of terror, Nathan was a veritable bogeyman. He came to the school directly from a pupil referral unit, having been expelled from 2 others. He was already 17 by the time he was put into Year 10 with the hope of catching up, and was consequently a good deal bigger than the other kids, especially those in the lower years. In the time before he was finally expelled for good, he managed to crack a Year 9's cheekbone, badly burn another boy's hands during an accident in a science class, and literally break the wrist of a young girl he had put into an arm lock before wrenching the limb upward until it snapped. After leaving school, he spent his useless days skulking around town, getting into trouble, fights and more trouble, until he ended up spending multiple nights in the cells at the precinct. He had been reported in over a dozen muggings around town and in the surrounding areas, mostly of younger kids, and was barred from almost every pub in the area. Most of the time Nathan was involved with stealing money, but in the end his undoing came with something far simpler and more childlike. I remember it was Halloween. The local kids, as they did every year, planned to go trick-or-treating in the evening, moving from house to house in their costumes, knocking on doors and asking for some sweets or chocolate, which was usually happily given. Oddly, considering the many creepy things that seem to go on in Moreton, Halloween usually goes off without a hitch. The whole town knows ahead of time when the kids are going to be out, and they keep an eye on each other to make sure nothing untoward happens, or at least that was the case, right up until 2018. On that Halloween night, I got calls about 3 separate incidents during which younger children had been robbed of their sweets by an older boy in a mask. Whilst the theft of some sweets isn't exactly the top of my priority list, it was the violence with which the sweets were taken that made me sit up. According to the victims, they had been threatened with a beating if they didn't give over what they had collected, and so, scared out of their wits by this boy towering over them, they had dutifully handed them over, only for their tormentor to then assault them anyway. In one case, he threw a girl to the ground and kicked her with such force that her tooth was knocked out. He had gotten what he wanted, but decided to inflict the violence anyway because it was never about the chocolate. For him, it was about the power and the sheer fun of doing it. I knew who had done it, of course. The marks on his knuckles, the lack of alibi, and the pockets full of sweet wrappers, despite being unable to name a single house he called at to trick or treat, convinced me immediately that it was Nathan. Yet there was not enough evidence for me to charge him. I remember watching him walk away laughing and noting how, as he grinned with his malicious shark-like grimace, he still had his teeth intact. By the time 2019 rolled around, I was determined to ensure that Nathan did not get away with such behaviour a second year on the trot. I increased the community policing, ensuring that there were bobbies on the beat and visibly making rounds whilst the kids went about their rounds in peace. Of course, this did have an obvious side effect. in that the police movements, being visible and predictable, left many blind spots that could be exploited. Unless, of course, the police had anticipated this ahead of time and left the blind spots as traps. But hen, who is that smart nowadays? Sure enough, Nathan, as stupid as he was malevolent, decided to chance his arm a second time around, and this time he'd prepared. Wearing a more concealing mask and full hoodie, he darted between the blind spots under the CCTV where he knew he would be off camera. Then he waited and eventually accosted two young boys who had unwisely strayed from the designated routes. Of course, I didn't see what happened next because there was no camera to record it, but witness statements say that Nathan threatened the boys with a knife before relieving them of the sweets they had collected. The next thing I heard from Nathan was a phone call at around 2 a.m. from local residents who claimed there was a boy rolling around in the kids' park, screaming, as if the devil had gotten him. Of course, I didn't know at the time it would be Nathan, but I rushed to investigate anyway. By the time I got there, he was naked. His thin body was covered all over with deep cuts where he had scratched and gouged at his skin with his fingernails. It is, I suppose, a small mercy that he never thought to use the knife he was alleged to have been carrying. Just as the caller had said, Nathan was screaming at the top of his lungs, squirming and writhing on the ground, kicking in circles and shaking his head so that foaming arcs of spittle flew in every direction. Seeing him like that, I have to say I wondered for a moment if the caller's description might have been right and the devil had got him. Nathan looked possessed. Trying to calm him with the help of a colleague, we eventually managed to restrain him in place as he raved and spat about monsters and devils. How the whole town was riddled with them, charging through the streets. How he'd seen them, with their green and orange faces. How they wanted to eat his skin, and they'd only let him live if he took it off and gave it to them. "I have to take the skin off," he cried. "I have to take it off." Within an hour, Nathan was at a hospital in a secure ward and heavily sedated. Blood tests revealed that he had imbibed a dangerous cocktail of powerful, and in some cases very rare substances that had made him hallucinate wildly. Of course, you can imagine the scenario. Hallucinating when you are not expecting to can be scary enough, but doing so when the streets are filled with children dressed as devils and goblins, witches and ghouls of every variety must have tugged at the edges of his mind and pulled it into very strange shapes, indeed. It was almost 2 days before Nathan stopped screaming. During that time, despite the sedatives, he did not sleep a wink, but rather screamed at the walls of his cell until his voice was hoarse, kicking and swatting at things that weren't there, and attacking his own skin until the medics were forced to restrain him. Why Nathan would choose to take such large amounts of these dangerous chemicals, and even where he could possibly have sourced some of them from, is a mystery. I have heard suggestions that the boys, knowing they were likely to be mugged, deliberately put something into the chocolate and sweets to punish Nathan. They somehow knowingly poisoned him, then laughed as he screamed and whirled in terrified confusion. Of course, we can never be sure of that because Nathan deliberately sought out the areas where the police would not be and the cameras didn't film. Even then, I remain unconvinced by this theory because it begs the very same questions. Where would a couple of schoolboys get such a potent cocktail of chemicals? How could they know the right dosage to cause the hallucinations but not cause death, and how would they get their hands on the far rarer stuff? It doesn't add up. I mean, if someone told me that the boys had been put up to it, that some older, wiser individual told them of the plan, gave them laced confectionery ahead of time, and guided them on where to walk to make it more likely they would be mugged, then perhaps I could believe it. Even then, though, it seems far-fetched. Who in Morton would ever have encountered those kinds of substances, or have access to them, perhaps by calling in a favour from colleagues in the city, whom indeed, I wonder, nobody comes to mind. Speaking of minds, Nathan's remains are in tatters. Whilst the effects of the chemicals would have disappeared entirely within a day or two, the trauma of what he saw, or at least believed he saw, was more than enough to put permanent cracks in Nathan's fragile psyche. According to one expert I spoke to, at least one of the substances found in his bloodstream is known to cause very introspective hallucinations, experiences during which anyone under the influence would have no choice but to turn inwards. I often wonder whether it was the horrors that Nathan saw there that scared him more than a series of costumes and masks. He remains in a secure ward and will probably be there for quite some time, which, although sad, is not something I lose much sleep about. As I said at the start, I have always hated bullies.